Okay, hi everyone. Today we are holding an event on justice for the Global South and climate justice. Joining us today to chat about these concepts will be Jacob, who you will meet in a moment, and I'm going to pass it to Jacob, who will introduce himself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kenzie. Thank you for having me. This is an exciting conversation for me as well. Jacob is community organizer, a campaign leader, project management strategist. I have skills and over 10 years of experience in designing, managing, and evaluating impactful programs. I also do movement buildings, and I'm part of movements, including climate change movements. I'm also engaged in strategic planning for organizations, organization strengthening, digital and offline campaigning. I also do training and facilitation, campaign coaching, volunteer engagement, and also support organizations and campaigns with multi-sectorial partnerships. Some of the organizations that I've worked with in this space include Be the Change Kenya, Amnesty International, UNICEF, and Change.org. I'm also a member of Young Africa Leadership Institute, or YALI, for those who have interacted with it, Leading Change Network, which is a global community organizing space. And also I'm a member of Global Grassroots Support Network, where I'm currently serving as the regional coordinator. Over to you.
Thanks, Jacob. So with the Hub and most of our listeners are based in so-called Canada, Jacob's based in Kenya. Now we say so-called because Canada was built on unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen land. So before we dive into our discussion, I would just like to stress the importance of today's content to our understanding of and action towards historic and ongoing colonization and dismantling that. So no matter where in SoCal Canada that you're joining from to benefit from this conversation, if you are a settler, you are benefiting from settler colonialism. And colonialism and imperialism have caused extensive layers of violence across the Global South, from the European invasion of most African countries to the United States takeover of the Philippines to the European takeover of Brazil and many, many more. We hope that this is a consideration that everyone listening can hold while listening and watching and carry with you in the ways that you reflect on and use the knowledge that's shared today in action. So just as one example, whether you're listening from SoCal Canada or elsewhere, Palestinians have been experiencing settler colonialism for several decades, and there's lots of local actions happening across the world that you can attend and support the ongoing resistance for a free Palestine. We do have several local actions linked in our bio for so-called Canadians. So with that, we'll dive into the bulk of our discussion today. So Jacob, first question. Could you give our listeners a bit more detail about who you are and how who you are has shaped your experiences moving through the world?
So I consider myself, just like I've mentioned, as a community organizer. And as a community organizer, I work with mostly grassroots communities and around campaigns. And while we offer a framework of campaigning, most of these campaigns revolves around issues that are related or caused by climate change. So for example, poverty-related campaigns, health-related campaigns that are also related with climate change. And so we've done this with supported national and national NGOs, but mostly grassroots social movements.
Amazing. And it might help because we're talking about the Global South, and not everybody knows what that means, and some people use different terms to describe that. So being based in Kenya, if there's other terms that you would prefer to use, or maybe if you want to explain for listeners how you would describe Global South, or yeah, any other words.
I would describe Global South as we understand this ourselves. This usually mostly when we say Global South in our context, we refer to countries that are within Africa continent or Latin America, Asia, or Oceania. These regions are often characterized by lower income levels, limited access to resources, and even technological challenges, access and challenges around technology, vulnerability to the impact of climate change due to especially geographical location and socioeconomic factors.
Yeah, thanks for that context. And I know in the land acknowledgement that I delivered, there was a bit of just review of sort of the history of how colonialism has, you know, brought so many layers of violence to the global South. And you mentioned about how, the global South is facing the most dire situation when it
Mhm.
comes to the climate crisis, in addition to being low income, which I mean, I think we can point to the roots of that being colonialism and capitalism. So I don't know if there's anything more that you would want to say about that, how these roots of violence sort of intersect and how they all sort of play into one another.
Yeah, I mean, it first serves to mention that these nations, being mostly underdeveloped, as less industry and even access to technology. As such, these countries emit less carbon into the airspace that heats up the atmosphere. However, despite this, less contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, they suffer the most adverse effect of climate change. It's on the global South nations that you will encounter severest of weather events, for instance loss of biodiversity, food insecurity, water scarcity, displacement of communities, and even just poverty and inequality that are caused or occasioned by climate change. I'll give one example of a community around Lake Victoria that largely relies on climate, that largely relies on Lake Victoria.
Oh, we might have just lost Jacob, so we'll just give it a moment. Um,
Um, So, for example, community around Lake Victoria that largely relies on the lake for its economic survival. This lake is it's the space that provides for them food on the table. It's this lake that gives take the children to schools. Yet with the climate change, the water levels in this lake has been very unpredictable. There are times that the water levels are so high that the community around the lake has to be displaced and they have to lose their homes and they also have to lose their livelihood. There are times that the water levels are so low, and as such, the entire community relies here on these water levels that ends up being polluted as well. The fish ends up dying and they cannot carry on as usual with their economic activities. This leads to like poverty levels increasing, scarcity of fish in the water, health and hygiene, since this is like their main source of water as well. And this is something that has been on the rise as well around the Lake Victoria, something called sex for fish, because the fish is so less and everyone is fighting for the little fish that has been caught by the fishermen. Then so there has to the fishermen start to ask for sexual favors. This has also led to increase in HIV prevalence. So these are some of the challenges that are faced by and this is just a story of one community in one country that's in the global South that is a replica of many other countries in the global South.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a really good example because you touched on so many different intersections of violence. It's really telling and really illustrates how interconnected all of these systems are. And kind of actually dipped into my next question that I had for you, which I don't know if you have further examples, but I mean, I think it's really great to illustrate this and understand it. So you've been a part of so many different projects, and I'm sure met with so many radical thinkers and activists and community members and all of the different experiences that you've had. And so going off of this example sharing, I was wondering if you have any more examples based on your experiences or stories that have been shared with you that could illustrate again for us, kind of just like you just did, but how justice for the Global South intersects with climate justice and how these relate.
Yeah, I mean, if you take example, for example, if you take, for example, the communities that lives around Lake Victoria, they're part of a country that, like Kenya, that you'd imagine are emitting less carbon into the air. And it's considering also its level of economy. It serves justice for the global north, countries to be able to look into, like, for example, the carbon emissions in their country, and also like the investment that they're making in their country. I'll give an example of a time when some of the economically stable nations were engaging with with Kenya on how they could, preserve forests, for instance, or how they could, invest into campaigns that are going into climate change as part of their what they're referring to as carbon credit. And so you realize that these communities end up suffering for I would say challenges that they contribute less to the creation. Oh.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think because I've been reading a book on the impact of NGOs in the continent of Africa and um, how these NGOs came in and they were, their goal was to alleviate poverty, and that was what they said they were going to do. And yet, from what you described, there's so many other systemic factors that, if not addressed, cannot address poverty. And so I was
Right.
wondering your thoughts about that, on anything that I just said about maybe like the impact of NGOs or even just, how you can't address one thing without addressing another.
So the NGOs, most of them are beginning to adopt systems thinking in how they are addressing, the challenges that they were set to address. And they're beginning to look at the intersectionalities. So, for example, intersectionality between organizations that work to reduce poverty, and how climate change, has affected or affects that, or education as vis-a-vis climate change, or health vis-a-vis climate change. So most of these, especially national NGOs, are beginning to think of these intersectionalities. But also many of the funders and donor space are also beginning to, think of how they can work directly with grassroots organizations that are working on climate change, vis-a-vis, working with organizations and having about 80% of their resources going into just planning and meetings. They're beginning to imagine of how they can work directly with the implementers or grassroots organizations that are working with communities around climate change or around issues that sort of intersect or relate with climate change. So, for example, you cannot address food insecurity in a country like Kenya without thinking of climate change. You cannot address health in a country like Kenya without thinking of climate change. They have to figure out what's the intersectionalities and, sort of concept of addressing the root cause vis-a-vis or versus addressing the symptoms.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you explained that really clearly. Um, and it's raising further questions for me that I want to pick your brain about, if it's okay if we move away from the questions that we prepared a little bit. Because I know, so uh, um for listeners, Jacob and I know each other in a work capacity through the Global Grassroots Support Network, and we've talked a lot about, with members of our community, about how NGOs can support the grassroots or how these can work together. Because we know from a lot of case studies that when these two work together, they can be successful. And so I wonder your thoughts, because we might have folks joining from NGOs, who might listen to this chat. I wonder what you would suggest to them as a grassroots campaigner in your context. Like, what would you suggest is the best way to work with the grassroots and work with them rather than take over what they're doing as well?
I think that battles between NGOs and grassroots or social movement or grassroots movements has been going on for some time now. When NGOs are saying grassroots movements are fluid, they do not have structures, they can't be audited, they can't be held accountable. But then the grassroots movement or social community movements, also saying NGOs being structures have a lot of bureaucracy, spend a lot of their money in, planning and meetings versus the actual work. But I think there's a level ground that can be achieved if they decide to work together and build synergy towards, also to avoid duplication of efforts, because they're bringing different skill sets, they're bringing different assets and resources into the table, towards particular, a change process. For example, and we recently had this conversation, and what was some of the issues that were emerging is that the grassroots organizations or grassroots movements wants to be heard. They want to be placed on the table as well. They want their voice to matter. They want to be part of the strategy, not just, being on the street. They want the donors to begin thinking of how to work with them also directly and to take them seriously. That does not mean that they want to escape, accountability, but they want a form of accountability that also works for them in their space. They also want to be able to design campaign outcomes and goals in a way that also reflects their work and they're comfortable with, but also in a way that, the donor meets the needs of the donor. Because sometimes, their funders comes with, these needs or these priorities or these expectations that sometimes vary from what they see, what they want or what they desire, and what's achievable on the ground for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what you said at the end, like with the difference in priorities, I think is something that we've talked about a little bit, and how, a donor comes in with ideas on what they think is going to solve the problem, and then when you go to the grassroots who are actually living the issue, they're able to tell you that that's not going to work, or that you need to
Right.
go in a different direction.
This is because they also work with the communities, and we
Mhm.
tend to think, and from even my own experience as working with the community around different issues, is that we tend to imagine, and especially from the global south, we tend to imagine that our counterparts from the global north has all this expertise and resources, and therefore they need to guide us. And as much as that it may be, there's a lot of resources as well in the global north. There's a lot of skills, a lot of expertise, and especially considering that grassroots movement work directly with the community. These are the people who bear the greatest adverse or challenges or effects of issue like climate change. They have the solution as well. If only they could be listened to and solution crafted from their experiences, then the change received or the change that's attained would be sustainable.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. Um, Yeah, and I think that you raise a really important point, and it's to be vulnerable for a moment. I think when I stepped into the role of the grassroots coordinator in our network, I thought that too. I thought, well, we've got lots of resources, we've got lots to offer the Global South, and boy, was I slapped in the face when I realized, oh, we're not experts at all. I mean, certainly we have an abundance, and we
Mm,
often don't think that we do, but we do have an abundance of funding, even if we don't think that we have enough, and the ability to create resources. But in terms of like lived experience and expertise, and even just
right,
like how to do effective campaigning,
right,
we do not we do not know. We are not the experts in
right.
comparison to campaigners that you're often probably working with. And I'd love to take some of the lessons that you have back to our audience, and like, what do you have to teach us? A lot, and maybe more than we can pack in this discussion.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that what I would want to teach, but probably just share experience of what, having worked across, in countries within the region, what I've also been able to see and learn myself as a community organizer, as a campaigner, is that one is that communities or countries or let's call them change advocates or activists or community organizers or movement builders within the countries that are located, especially in Africa, I would speak in Africa, have a history and a very rich history of community organizing. And this, stems from just the way the culture of communities works in Africa. It was closely knit together. Things were done together, children were raised together as a community, issues were solved together. So it's kind of, there's a lot of lessons that organizers have been able to pick from what we would refer to as the normal community trend or the normal community way of life. And this has helped in, hone their skills in mobilizing communities, building networks, fostering collective actions, and special environmental issues. I've also been able to see these advocates emphasize on, I would say, intersectorial collaborations. And they are being aware that, and especially government in these regions, usually we call them strongman government or strong leadership government, where if you are, for example, an activist, the chances that they would come very hard on you. So you have to figure out how do you survive within the space. So one of those means that I've seen is intersectorial collaborations, where they work across sectors and disciplines to address complex challenges. So they have to collaborate with diverse stakeholders, including local governments, the national government itself, NGOs that have resources. For example, if you're arrested, NGOs that can come and bail you out, indigenous communities that have the knowledge and history of regions, civil society organizations. And so they have to be able to survive, you have to develop more of an inclusive approach to solutioning. I've also seen indigenous knowledge and practices being gathered by the change leaders or activists being very intentional as they gather traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable practices that are valuable in addressing issues like climate change. The advocates for leverage indigenous wisdom within communities to address issues like biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity, and just generally being conscious that these communities are strength and being able to study that and understand the power dynamics that works within community. In terms of policy advocacy, I've seen most change leaders in different countries. And of course, this also varies. If you come to Africa, for example, this would vary from country to country, region to region. Like, for example, East Africa would have a bit more relaxed political space as compared to, I would say, Central Africa, for instance. And it calls for change leaders. And I've seen them respond to this call by being able to gather experience and intentionally navigate complex, policy landscapes, being able to engage the policymakers, influence decision-making processes, and advocate for equitable, inclusive, policies and that prioritizes vulnerable community. And this is, again, is driven by the fact that political environments can sometimes, change. Resilient building is something that I've also seen these activists put a lot of emphasis on. Storytelling and communication. Storytelling is a traditional African thing, I would say. As we were growing up, we grew up being told things to do and things not to do using stories. If my grandmother, for example, would say, "Don't walk in the dark," then I would find myself walking in the dark. Or don't go to this place, or don't go. You would find yourself defying those instructions until they are told using stories. Then they stick with you. You remember them for long. So most activists have adopted storytelling as a way of communicating the challenge, but also as a way of inspiring people to take actions with them. They have also, again, in the global north, and especially Africa for this instance, the majority of population is youth. So activists and change leaders and advocates have crafted strategy that allows youth to be able to drive change. And this ensures that there is innovation, there's energy, there's longevity, sustainability of these efforts for a very long period of time. Yeah, I think that's some of the pointers that I've been able to take myself. And probably you could also pick a lesson or two from them.
Yeah, a number of lessons. I was trying to take notes on things I wanted to ask you more about, and I don't think that I took as many as I wanted to. You had so much to say there, and I'll probably have more questions after I watch this back. Um, so yeah, I want to ask you a few about a few things that you mentioned there. And just to intersect or to interject momentarily for listeners, all of this is going to go up on a wiki page that we've developed on the Global South, and we did some initial research to try to compile a few examples on how justice for the Global South is a climate justice issue, and everything that Jacob is sharing will also be added to that page. Um, so I do want to ask you a little bit about a few things. And one thing that really stuck out to me that I thought was really interesting is this storytelling piece. Well, there was a lot of interesting pieces of what you said, but the storytelling piece I think was really interesting because um, I mean, in my experience and when I think to what has drawn me to a lot of different campaigns, it has always been a story. And when we talk to people on the street and we're trying to, have one-to-one conversations with them, you often don't move them until you tell a story.
Right, right.
Um, and being based in SoCal, Canada, we can, look to our Indigenous communities who use stories and have been using stories for thousands of years to explain everything, to explain the way that the seasons are changing and the way that the food is changing. And so I think that's a really interesting point that you made. And I wonder if you have any other advice for people who have maybe never told their story to to share about a why people should join a campaign or who are
Mhm.
hesitant to share to use storytelling. What advice would you maybe have?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's worth mentioning that as much as stories have been used in the African context for long, to educate, to preserve culture, to advise, for many, many other reasons that are of the benefit of this of the storyteller and the listener. Many of the advocates were not intentional. When they're using stories. And I think I've learned this during my period of community organizing and, a trainer and a coach of public narrative. First is that when you approach people and tell them, hey, use your story, they'll be like, but I don't have a story. But one thing that we have learned, and I have learned personally from, teaching and coaching public narrative is that one, everyone has a story. Everyone has a reason of doing what they're doing. Everyone has that, aha moment. Or that moment when they decided I cannot entertain this challenge anymore. I have to take an action. And it's from there that you're able to craft your story, from your own experiences that you're able to craft your story. First to inspire yourself, because again, strategy fails sometimes. Strategy get boring sometimes. Strategy takes long sometimes. And sometimes you end up questioning why you're doing what you're doing, why that does. So being able to ask yourself why climate change matters to you. When was that moment that you realized that, something has to be done about climate change in my space? And crafting a story from that and reminding yourself that story inspires not only you, but also inspires people who listens to you and who could take, action with you. I've also seen stories, and even myself, I've used stories to call people to collections. We do say that the mind is the worst place to engage people. And this is because people have different experiences, different level of education, different backgrounds, and all this stuff goes to your head. So whenever you're telling people the number of people who are dying because of climate change in this particular country, they're all doing their income tax in their heads. It's until you start, talking to them about particular stories, like for example, the stories of the sex for fish stories, the HIV stories in Lake Victoria, then people begin to listen with their heart. And when they listen with their heart, they're inspired. They don't think of what they do not have. They don't think of the skills they do not have, but they think with their heart, that the desire to take action.
Yeah, yeah. What an important lesson. And I think you raised a really good point that the story of Lake Victoria is something that will absolutely be like probably the a big thing that I remember from this discussion. Because I didn't know that and I think it definitely ties into some of the own stories that I have, and it is relatable. And I think that's just what storytelling is people can relate a lot more than to numbers. Um,
Right.
yeah. I wanted to ask you a few more things about things that you mentioned. One of those is about how the majority of the population is youth in your context.
Mhm.
And certainly in our context in so-called Canada, and I'm sure in much of the global north, the youth are definitely spearheading a lot of our movements. And so I don't know, I guess I just wonder like what advice that you have from talking to youth
Mhm.
in East Africa or um, yeah, because it's certainly a challenge to be a youth and to try to be an activist and you know
Right.
trying to do so many things with
Right.
your own life and here you are being an activist as well. So yeah, I guess just what advice would you have for youth activists?
So first, the advice I would have for communities and countries is to adopt intergenerational approach to solving climate change. And by that, also putting emphasis on supporting the youth in being able to, be better activists for climate change. And this is because one, youths have the, fresh perspective, they are the innovative ideas, they have the energy, they have the tech ability to drive transformative change in climate change and issues that relates to climate change. And for young people, my advice for them would be we don't really have a choice in this space because if you look at, for example, our governments, and especially in the global south, the leaders of those governments are not youth. And sometimes they imagine that maybe they do not have a lot of years to live, and they might not bear the consequences of their actions now. But youths have no choice. These consequences will get them while they're still young or while getting into their prime times of lives, and they will bear the greatest brand. It's therefore important for them to occupy space, take charge. It won't be easy. It's not easy, especially the global South youth are not mostly hard. And so they have to sometimes be innovative, be a bit tactical in how they occupy space and ensure that they're being at how they're using their numbers and ensure that they're being at. If you take, for example, a country like Senegal that recently had election, had one of the youngest presidents in Africa. And this is because the youth decided to take charge and say, hey, this is our country. We want to be able to direct the future of this country, the issues that this country start to prioritize on, and that will start with having a youth leader at the national or at the helm of our government. So yeah, it won't be easy. There's a lot to juggle as a young person. The challenges, probably education is here with you. Young families here with you. But then, just being able to intentionally plan around yourself and understand that this is about your future and the future of your children. It should be inspiring enough to take to have a space in your life to take action.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think something you mentioned there about intergenerational organizing is interesting to me because um, I definitely think that we could listen to elders in movements a little bit more in at least in my context, where I'm organizing and yeah, making more of an effort to do that. And um, I think related, I don't know why my brain is going to this, but you know, a lot of of our movement spaces in the global north have been thinking a lot more about other forms of systemic oppression and how that is an influence in our movement spaces. And I guess I'm just thinking about how you mentioned I don't know if you directly mentioned this, but um, there's a lot of networks in the con across the continent of Africa, and I imagine that there's a lot of different positionalities and identities that would come into play. So even just thinking about like young and old people working together, that can be a challenge. And then thinking about, you know, the other identities that people would carry, how that would be really challenging in such big network spaces. So I would be curious how that's navigated, and if you have advice for people in other contexts because it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah. I think from, again, I'll just share my experience. When we started organizing with communities and, as a young person, having to bring, intergenerational, actors into a space, and you realize that, culture start to play, religion start to come into play, where the religious leaders probably want to be elected or nominated to leadership position, or where older members of the community want to take space and be heard and can't be challenged by younger people from younger generation. So it took a bit of time to be able to build synergy and create a space. It took a bit of, also push and pull a little bit, a bit of education, a bit of storytelling, a bit of strategy, work together to get them to understand that, yes, there's something that as an older generation you are bringing into the space. You're definitely bringing experience. You're definitely bringing, country history into the space, or challenge history into the space. You definitely know or have stories of how, where the rain started beating us in terms of climate change. But also you have to understand that in terms of technology, the young person would be faster than you in terms of having to juggle, a number of things together. At the same time, a young person would be much better. And also have to be able to understand that in this era, really, a young woman can also stand in front of you as an older man in the community and give you that direction. And so it took a bit of challenge, took a bit of education, took a bit of action together for them to be able to understand, took a bit of giving challenging tasks so that, sometimes, you set them up, especially if you have difficult members of team, you give them a bit of a difficult task so that they struggle and can be able to see the importance of the person that they were imagining would not be helpful to them. And of course, a bit of longer time, but eventually we were able to get to a point where we understand and accept that intergenerational approach is the way to go, because it brings a lot of resources into one pool that we can convert into the power necessary for us to achieve the change that we are looking for.
That is a really good strategy that I'm gonna carry with me is throwing people into a challenge and going, oh, wait a second, I don't have the knowledge and skills for this, but that person that I just thought wouldn't be useful definitely does. That's a really, really good strategy. Um, yeah, so we're coming up near the hour, so I do want to pull a few more thoughts from your brain, if that's all right. Um, so I know I'll just I don't know if you have a lot to say about this specific situation, but I know in our context, something that people have been thinking about more is the situation in Congo, which is great that people are starting to think about that. People were looking at Palestine and they were going, okay, well, there's also Congo and there's also Sudan and there's also Hawaii and there's all of these places that are in very similar situations, Kashmir as well. Um, and so I guess I mean, I'm just thinking about you know, if there's any, I don't know what the situation is in terms of advocacy and activism for the situation in Congo, um, in your context in East Africa. Um,
Mhm.
but I'm wondering, I don't know, at this point, is there advice or direction that you as a multi-layered campaign strategist, trainer, all of these things, community organizer, what would you say to somebody in the global north who's thinking about this and who maybe wants to work to address this? What do you do? That's a huge question, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so the situation in Congo has been going on for a while. And it's a very tricky situation that has also a lot of multi-layer political implications. Sometimes, some that are hidden, some that as what is being referred to as external influence. But what is challenging is that it's the vulnerable community that ends up suffering the most. Congo is one of the richest countries in Africa. If you look at in terms of the natural resources that they have in their possession, yet it has the hugest number of or high levels of poverty in country. economy that is struggling in Africa as well. It's very unfortunate. And as much as this is attributed to issues like corruption, poor governance, it's also attributed to Western influence to some degree, and exploitation of natural resources by, externals also to some degree. It's so unfortunate that it's the local that, should be benefiting from the natural resources and is not. The most unfortunate situation also is that this violence in Congo has potential to spill over to the neighboring countries and, resulting to, for example, refugees in the neighboring countries that end up exerting pressures into the economies of the neighboring countries. Now, again, just like in many African countries, especially in the west of Africa, the political space is very limited for them to operate. Activists have I wouldn't say they have as much space as in Kenya, or as in Tanzania, or as in Uganda to be able to operate. It therefore calls for them to take, again, collaborative approach to be able to mitigate the risk of being targeted by the governments or by the beneficiaries of the status quo within their country. It calls for them to be very tactical. And like I've seen many of them that I've had conversations with, and listen to some of the tactics they're applying, being able to move together, being able to build synergy, and to build networks within civil society organization, being able to work closely with the community, ends up mitigating the risk of them being, for example, arrested or targeted for violence, or harassed, or even forced to flee, or illegally persecuted, or forced eviction, or stigmatized even within their community, or even targeted with smear campaigns. So, because these are challenges that they face as the natural resources is an emotive country in Western Africa. Just like land, for example, in East Africa, it's very emotive, and has had what we are calling historical injustices. So yeah, it's a very tricky affair. There's a very tricky balance.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that context. I think it's a really great example of so many different things, like what you describe about how it is such an abundant country in terms of resources, and yet the people who should be benefiting from that are not. And the influence of so many other different things, especially, yeah, certainly there are Western influences that people are starting to recognize and address, which is exciting. And certainly in the global north, we don't face the same risks to being an activist that somebody who's trying to do that in Congo would face. So I hope that that's something that listeners think about and carry with them.
Mm.
So I have one more question to close off today, unless there's anything you want to add after this question. But I was wondering if you have any actionable suggestions, or at least as actionable as we can get, because it's a tough question to answer. But for climate justice activists in the global north, so maybe somebody, some of the listeners who are based in SoCal, Canada, if they wanted to better prioritize the needs of the global south, or we can even just look specifically to your context, to organizers that are based in Kenya, if we wanted to support them, how could they do that? How could they support their campaign efforts? What would be something that would be useful? And yeah.
Right. So for this situation to be addressed, it requires multifaceted approach. First, it's being able to understand that all parties have a role to play in addressing climate change in these countries. So, for example, Global North, as much as Global South has a role to play, and activists have stepped up, seen governments making commitments as well, governments, reaching out to governments in the global north, for climate financing conversations. There's a lot that still can be done. And some of this that can be done first is being able to work closely with the networks that are in their countries, being able to work closely with the government, and being able to push for provision of financial and technological support towards supporting efforts of addressing climate change, transferring some of the ideas that they have implemented, especially around climate-friendly technologies, and also just being able to campaign, and work with the governments in means and ways of reducing emissions, figuring out sustainable practices, but also over and above, high-level policy work or advocacy work on honoring commitments. I know there has been a challenge of that, where we have all these great documents with very detailed commitments, but no proper actions. Yeah, but over and above, collaborations between Global South and Global North is very, very necessary to be able to address or come up with strategies that can mitigate, climate action effects or climate effects, climate change effects. Yeah, I don't know if that's it's helpful for the activists in the Global North.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. And I hope that this is a question that people are thinking about. I think at least it seems that there's been a bit of a paradigm shift with Palestine and people recognizing that these are fights that have to be fought together and they're not isolated in silos. And so I hope that people continue to think about these kind of questions, which are difficult to answer. So thank you for trying. And definitely I think there were some lessons to be pulled from that.
Right, right, right.
So is there anything else that you wanted to add for our listeners before we close off today? Your time was so appreciated, and I hope that everyone was pleased with this conversation. Because I'm always really happy to talk to you, Jacob.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, ideally, just to add is that these kind of conversations are very important because climate change affects all of us. It started with, climate change is coming, but now we're talking about climate change being here. The effects are real and adverse, as can be seen in our communities. Areas that had water are struggling with scarcity of waters, communities that are unsustainable food production plan as struggling with food scarcity and poverty. Forests have been cut to create spaces for people to live in because the land issues is the motive. And so yeah, it requires collaborative effort of both Global North and Global South to be able to address these challenges. As much as Global South also says that they are emitting less carbon into the air, and Global North emitting more carbon into the air. And appreciating, of course, this it's important, but also the push and pull and blame game will not get us anywhere. It's just that stronger countries, more richer countries have to recognize that we are better positioned and we are able therefore to give more into the cause of addressing climate change. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really good thought to leave on. The blame game is something that I think we do in our movements too. And at some point we just gotta just act on it and recognize that it's
Yeah.
for the best of all of us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I'm really, really pleased that we got to have you chat about these concepts, and I'm really excited to listen back and add it to our wiki page because you have so much knowledge and wisdom to share. So, thank you, thank you. And for our listeners, if you do want to stay engaged and you haven't yet, be sure that you sign up for the Hub's newsletter. We share things like events, updates, and various other updates that might be of interest to you. The link is in our bio. And with that, thank you, Jacob. We'll close our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.